Would you like to understand what the dark side, or also called the shadow of human nature, is? Then listen to this entire video where I explain it in relative detail. Now, you may have heard of the term the shadow self or the shadow in human psychology. It's referring to an instinctual subsection of your psyche which incorporates, let's say, undesirable thought patterns and behaviors, or is the source of undesirable thought patterns and behaviors, including resentment, anger, like a need for violence, for inflicting pain and suffering on others, also sexual urges, greed, envy, etc. The list goes on. And psychoanalysts like Carl Jung identified the shadow as an archetype of the collective unconscious, which is essentially a deeply ingrained section of our psyche, which is present in all humans across cultures, so universally, which is inherited from our ancestors and is the product of, well, millions of years of development, of human evolution, and it's a part of our nature. It is a reality of who we are. Now, there are two reasons why the human consciously doesn't like to acknowledge it. It's firstly because it's not nice to attribute your ego or your personality to these violent, dark traits. No one wants to be attributed as an evil person, certainly not when considering yourself, because it hurts your ego. And second of all, society has repressed the behavior and open the expression of these evil or these dark thoughts and behaviors, because of course it is socially unacceptable to murder, which is of course a good thing. It is socially unacceptable to violently beat each other up, let's say, and of course all the other evil acts or acts against humanity, for example, they are socially unaccepted. Hence, we learn to repress them because we want to survive as humans, and the lone wolf dies but the pack survives, as quoting from Game of Thrones. If you're alone, the rate of survival is a lot lower than if you're in a group, because in a group you can split survival tasks. For example, in primitive days, one person could collect firewood, the other person could go hunting, whereas if you're all alone, you have to do everything yourself, and of course that's difficult. And 5 brains are better than 1 brain, let's say. So we learn to repress the shadow in us in order to be included in the group and be part of the social institutions in our life, in order to stay also sane, because that's what we do to each other as friends and family in the community. You keep each other mentally sane, you keep each other in check. That's also vital for survival, and of course you benefit off resources from each other. And as I said, the shadow or the dark side consists of these violent attributes like envy, greed, selfishness, desire, all which are looked down upon, so we repress them. And we are socially conditioned, so we don't bring these to manifestation. Now, if we sort of try and delve deeper into this shadow, what is it exactly? I like to think of it as like it's a part of you which wants to self-sabotage. It's, for example, have you ever said something very mean, or you wanted to say something really mean and sort of nasty, and then maybe you said it or maybe you didn't, but whilst you were thinking it, like, you wanted to say it. There's this sort of like urge inside of you to just sort of bash someone for no really constructive reason, maybe, but you just wanted to. Or yourself, let's say what behavior is, so let's say, severely suboptimal. Let's say eating excessive junk food or consuming excessive amounts of drugs and alcohol. I mean, generally one knows, I would assume, that that's perhaps not so healthy for you, but you still do it. And there's a part of you that sort of wants to do it, that wants to self-sabotage. And I think that's sort of attributed to the shadow also. But I think, I'm not quite sure where it stems from or what it is, because it is a very dark, like it's, why would humans be sort of structured like that? And I think it's also the narrative of the line between good and evil. I believe Nietzsche said it, I'm not sure, it may have been Carl Jung. It said that, the line between good and evil doesn't run through the government, politicians, or corporations. The line between good and evil runs directly through your soul, and that's the evil that's the shadow, let's say. And this dynamic of good and evil, or the shadow, I think is nicely portrayed in the story of Cain and Abel and Genesis in the Bible, because Cain and Abel are brothers. I mean, I'll go into this video, I will deconstruct it in another video in depth probably, but it's that, Cain represents the evil and Abel the good, and both of them offer sacrifices to God, and God likes Abel because he sort of offers his first-class sacrifices, and Cain doesn't offer his first-class sacrifices and isn't so appreciated by God. But Cain he's quite arrogant. He thinks he can maneuver through life himself. He doesn't need to believe or have faith in, I don't know if it was God or have some sort of faith. He sort of thought he could deal with everything himself, and most importantly, he doesn't take responsibility for his suboptimal sacrifices or his behavior. And this resentment sort of builds inside of him, and that's where I think resentment feeds the shadow. So he gets resentful because he sees Abel, and he feels like he himself, Cain, should be rewarded the same way as Abel does, but he's not being rewarded, and he doesn't take responsibility for his actions, which are probably a reason why he's not rewarded adequately. And you get resentful when you don't get what you want, and Cain doesn't get what he wants. And then, of course, Cain kills his brother out of, resentment, I would say. And then further afterwards, God, I believe, punishes Cain, and Cain still doesn't take responsibility for his action because his anger and resentment is so overpowering that he just sort of loses touch of what is right and what's wrong, and that's the shadow. Now, I will do another video on this. I mean, by the way, Cain and Abel, the story, I think it's not like, we all once stemmed from Cain and Abel. Like, no, it's more of a ancient people, or people over time, observed human nature, and they wrote a story about human nature. They reflected human nature in these stories, and that's what Cain and Abel is. Essentially, many stories from the Bible are. They are reflections. They imitate human nature, and they imitate human psychology. So there's a lot to be learned from them, I think. And this is the dynamic between good and evil, Cain and Abel. And it's quite dark that Cain essentially kills Abel. And the main takeaway from understanding the shadow is that, it can destroy your life if you don't incorporate it into your consciousness. Now, if we go back to the collective unconscious and archetypes, the argument is essentially we have these instincts in our collective unconscious, and they govern our life. And if you don't make them conscious in your life, they govern you. But if you make them conscious, you can take more control of them, understand them, and maneuver around them or work with them, not that they work against you. So you need to incorporate your shadow into your personality, which is highly beneficial, I think, but it's difficult because it entails looking at your dark side, and that's quite frightening. But there's a huge marginal benefit of it. And I'll do my next video probably on how to integrate the shadow in your personality. So that was a video on what the shadow self is, or the shadow archetype is. And by the way, archetypes are sort of behavioral patterns, instinctual behavioral patterns of human nature. And they're essentially as many archetypes as there are sort of typical situations that a human may be in. And when a human is placed into this situation, typically the archetype arises, or it like manifests itself in that situation. Or if you repress the archetype, then pathologies arise. And I think if you repress the shadow, also pathologies do arise, and it'll eventually jump out at you and take control, and that's not very desirable. But I'll explain that more in detail in the next video. So thank you for listening.